Some promises are made with the pure heart of a child, meant to last forever. Others fade like dust in the wind, forgotten by everyone except the one who made them. In a small Wyoming town, ranch hand Travis McKenna had long given up on love when a 6-year-old girl once told him she'd marry him when she grew up. He laughed it off. 20 years later, she rode back into town, no longer a child, but a woman with a ring in her pocket and a promise she never forgot. But would a lonely man who'd convinced himself he wasn't worth loving be ready to believe again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the rolling hills that surrounded Copper Ridge. Travis McKenna stood on the porch of the bunkhouse, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching the day come alive with the familiar sounds of ranch life. At 62, his frame still carried the strength of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. Though the years had etched lines around his eyes and silvered his dark hair at the temples, he took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the bitter warmth as he surveyed the land that had been his world for the past 2 decades. The Broken Arrow Ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, its fences marking boundaries he knew by heart, its cattle dotting the pastures like scattered stones. This was home, or as close to home as a man like Travis figured he deserved, the leather journal tucked in his shirt pocket pressed against his chest, a constant companion that held 20 years of sparse entries, most no longer than a line or two. Weather reports, cattle counts, the occasional observation about the changing seasons. He'd never been much for words, finding comfort instead in the rhythm of honest work and the company of horses who asked nothing more than care and respect. Morning. Travis! Jeremiah Winters, owner of the Broken Arrow, approached with his own cup of coffee and the easy gait of a man comfortable in his own skin. At 78, Jeremiah moved with the careful deliberation of age, but his eyes remained sharp and kind. He'd taken Travis on 20 years ago, no questions asked about his past, and that trust had never wavered. Morning, Jeremiah. Travis touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. Cattle look good in the south pasture. Grass is coming in thick after last week's rain. Good to hear. Jeremiah settled beside him on the porch railing, both men falling into the comfortable silence that comes from years of shared mornings. You planning to check the northern fence line today? Figured I would. Spotted some loose wire yesterday. They stood together in companionable quiet, 2 men who understood that the best conversations often happened without words. Travis had learned to appreciate these moments of peace, though lately they carried an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite name, a restlessness that settled in his bones when the work was done, and the evening stretched long before him. It hadn't always been this way. 20 years ago, when he'd first arrived in Copper Ridge, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of ghosts, the solitude had been a blessing. The ranch offered healing in its endless demands, and Travis had thrown himself into the work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. But time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges, and somewhere along the way, the solitude had transformed from sanctuary to something approaching loneliness. Not that he'd ever admit such a thing. A man his age had no business entertaining romantic notions. He'd made his peace with the choices that led him here. And if that peace sometimes felt more like resignation, well, that was the way of things. The memory surfaced without warning, as it sometimes did on mornings when the light fell just right across the yard. A little girl with pigtails and eyes the color of summer sky, no more than 6 years old, standing in this very spot with the serious expression children wear when they're about to share something monumentally important. I will marry you when I grow up, she'd announced with the absolute certainty that only children possess, her small hand slipping into his much larger one. You're the nicest man in the whole world, and when I'm big like Mama, I'm going to be your wife. Travis had chuckled, genuinely charmed by her earnestness, and gently explained that by the time she was grown, He'd be too old for such foolishness. But Adelaide, sweet little Adelaide Summers, had simply shaken her head with that stubborn tilt to her chin that reminded him so much of her mother. "I don't care if you're old," she'd declared. "I'll still love you just the same." The Summers family had been passing through town, their wagon train heading west toward Oregon Territory. They'd stopped for supplies and stayed 3 days while her father recovered from a bout of fever. 3 days that had somehow managed to carve themselves into Travis's memory with startling clarity. The sound of Adelaide's laughter as she followed him around the ranch, her endless questions about the horses and cattle, her complete lack of fear around animals that made grown men nervous. Her parents had been kind folks, the sort who saw the good in people even when the world had given them little reason for such faith. They'd included Travis in their evening meals, listened to his stories about the land, and never once made him feel like the broken-down drifter he knew himself to be. When they'd left to rejoin their wagon train, little Adelaide had hugged him tight and whispered her promise one more time, as if to make sure he wouldn't forget. He'd watched their wagon disappear over the horizon, taking with it the brief warmth of family he'd almost forgotten he was capable of feeling. The little girl's promise had stayed with him for weeks afterward, a sweet echo that gradually faded as the demands of ranch life reclaimed his attention. That had been 20 years ago. 20 years of seasons turning, cattle growing fat and being sold, fences mended and mended again. 20 years of watching other men find wives and raise families while he remained content, or convinced himself he was content, with the company of horses and the endless sky. "You're thinking loud again," Jeremiah observed, his voice carrying the gentle humor that had made him such an easy man to work for all these years. Travis glanced at his employer, unsurprised to find those keen eyes studying him, with the attention of a man who'd learned to read people the way others read books. "Just wool gathering?" Jeremiah nodded sagely. "The dangerous kind or the harmless kind?" "The kind that doesn't bear thinking about," Travis replied, draining his coffee cup and straightening his shoulders. "I should get to that fence line." "Travis!" Jeremiah's voice carried a note of seriousness that made Travis pause. "You know I think of you as the son I never had." The words hit Travis somewhere in the center of his chest, unexpected in their directness. In 20 years, Jeremiah had never been one for sentimental declarations, though his actions had always spoken of deep affection and respect. "I know," Travis said quietly. "I feel the same about you." "Then hear me when I say this. A man who's lived as good a life as you have deserves whatever happiness he can find. Don't go convincing yourself otherwise, just because you've gotten comfortable with being alone." Travis studied the older man's face, seeing something in his expression that suggested this wasn't idle conversation. "You trying to tell me something specific?" "Just that sometimes the good Lord works in mysterious ways, and a smart man keeps his heart open to possibilities." Jeremiah pushed himself off the railing with a grunt, even when those possibilities seemed to come from nowhere. Before Travis could ask what that was supposed to mean, Jeremiah was walking back toward the main house, leaving him alone with his coffee and a growing sense that this day was going to be different from all the others that had come before it. The thought should have unsettled him more than it did. Instead, as he set off toward the northern pasture with his tools and a head full of questions, Travis found himself almost looking forward to whatever surprise the day might bring. It had been a long time since he'd felt anything approaching anticipation, and the sensation was both foreign and oddly welcome. The fence line work took most of the morning, requiring the kind of focused attention that usually kept his mind from wandering. But today, even the familiar rhythm of post-setting and wire stretching couldn't keep his thoughts from drifting back to Jeremiah's cryptic words. By the time he'd finished the repairs and loaded his tools back into the wagon, the sun was high overhead and his curiosity had grown into something approaching impatience. He was just turning the wagon toward home when he spotted the dust cloud on the eastern road, a single rider, moving at an easy pace, in no particular hurry, but clearly heading for the ranch. Travis shaded his eyes against the sun, trying to make out details at this distance, but the rider was still too far away to identify. Visitors weren't unusual at the Broken Arrow, but something about this one made Travis pause. Maybe it was the way the rider sat their horse, straight and confident, but with an unhurried grace that spoke of someone comfortable in the saddle. Maybe it was simply the timing, coming so soon after Jeremiah's strange comments about keeping his heart open to possibilities. Or maybe, Travis thought as he clicked his tongue and urged his own horse toward home. It was just the remnant of a 6-year-old girl's promise, finally catching up with him after 20 years of patient waiting. The late afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Travis finally saw her clearly. She sat astride a beautiful chestnut mare, her posture confident and relaxed, dark hair pinned back beneath a well-worn hat that had seen better days. Even at a distance, there was something familiar about the way she held herself, something that made his chest tighten with a recognition he couldn't quite place. As she drew closer to the ranch buildings, Travis found himself slowing his wagon, giving himself time to study this unexpected visitor. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of natural grace that comes from a lifetime around horses. Her traveling clothes were practical but well-made, and the silver wedding ring tucked safely in her saddlebag caught the light as her horse shifted. It wasn't until she was perhaps 50 yards away that Travis felt the bottom drop out of his world. Those eyes, summer sky blue and filled with a quiet determination that took him back 20 years in the space of a heartbeat. The curve of her smile, the way she tilted her head slightly to one side when she was thinking, the stubborn set of her chin that had charmed him when she was 6 years old. "Adelaide," he whispered, the name barely audible over the creak of his wagon wheels. She reined in her horse just outside the main yard and dismounted with fluid grace, her gaze never leaving his face. Up close, the transformation was even more striking. The pigtails had given way to thick dark hair that caught copper highlights in the sun. The round face of childhood had refined into elegant angles, and her small frame had developed into the willowy height of womanhood. But those eyes were exactly the same, filled with the same unwavering certainty that had stayed with him all these years. "Hello, Travis," she said, her voice carrying the warm tones of the little girl he remembered overlaid with the confidence of a woman who knew her own mind. "I told you I'd be back." Travis climbed down from his wagon on legs that suddenly felt unreliable, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. 20 years of wondering what had become of the Summers family. 20 years of occasional dreams about a little girl's impossible promise. And here she stood, as if no time had passed at all. "Adelaide Summers," he managed, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't prepared to feel. "Lord have mercy." She smiled then, that same radiant expression that had lit up the ranch yard 2 decades ago. "It's Adelaide Hartwell now, actually." Was anyway. Her expression sobered slightly. "I'm a widow, Travis. Have been for 3 years." The news hit him like a physical blow, not because he had any claim to joy or sorrow in her life, but because the thought of this vibrant woman enduring such loss seemed impossibly cruel. "I'm sorry for your troubles." "Thank you." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and tears in equal measure. "But I didn't come here to talk about the past. I came to keep a promise." Before he could ask what she meant, Adelaide reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a small velvet pouch. With careful fingers, she opened it and revealed a simple silver ring, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. The sight of it made Travis's breath catch. "I bought this with the first money I ever earned," she said, holding the ring up to catch the light. "I was 14, working in a dress shop in Denver. The jeweler thought I was buying it for my mother. But I told him the truth. I was buying it for the man I was going to marry." Travis felt the world shift around him, reality bending in ways that made no sense. "Adelaide, you can't be serious." "I told you I'd marry you when I grew up," she said simply, pressing the ring into his palm and closing his fingers around it. Well, I'm grown up now. The metal was warm from her touch, solid and real against his skin. Travis stared down at their joined hands, his mind reeling with the impossibility of what she was suggesting. You were 6 years old. 6-year-olds say all manner of things they don't mean. I meant it then, and I mean it now. Her voice carried absolute conviction, the same unwavering certainty that had charmed him 20 years ago. I know how it sounds, Travis. I know what people will think, but I've loved you my whole life, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because it makes other folks comfortable. Adelaide. He looked up into those familiar blue eyes, seeing the earnest determination that had sustained her through 2 decades of separation. I'm old enough to be your father. Hell, I'm older than your father was when you left here. I don't care about that. She stepped even closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used and see the gold flecks in her eyes. Do you remember what you told me that last night, when I said I'd marry you when I grew up? Travis's memory supplied the words with painful clarity. I said by the time you were grown, I'd be too old for such foolishness, and I said I didn't care if you were old, that I'd love you just the same. Adelaide's smile was soft and infinitely patient. 20 years haven't changed my mind, Travis. Have they changed yours? The question hung between them, like a bridge he was afraid to cross. Travis looked down at the ring again, its simple elegance speaking of dreams sustained across impossible distances and improbable circumstances. When he looked up, he found half the ranch hands gathered at a respectful distance, their faces showing varying degrees of curiosity and amazement. This is madness, he said. But his voice lacked conviction even to his own ears. Maybe it is. Adelaide reached up and gently touched his cheek, her fingers cool against his skin. But it's the kind of madness that's kept me going through some very dark times. It's the kind of madness that brought me home. Home. The word settled over him like a warm blanket, carrying with it implications he wasn't ready to examine. Travis closed his eyes, feeling 20 years of careful solitude cracking like ice in spring. I can't ask you to do this, he said finally. I'm set in my ways, Adelaide. I'm not the kind of man who knows how to make a woman happy. You're not asking. I'm offering. She stepped back, giving him space to breathe, but keeping her eyes locked on his face. I know you don't understand how I can feel this way about someone I knew for 3 days when I was 6 years old. I'm not sure I understand it myself, but I know that in 20 years of living, no one has ever made me feel as safe and valued as you did in those 3 days. No one has ever looked at me the way you did, like I was something precious and worth protecting. Travis felt his throat tighten with emotion he'd spent 20 years learning to suppress. You were just a child, I was. But you saw me, Travis, really saw me. Not just as someone's daughter or a pretty face or a burden to be managed. You saw me as a person with thoughts and feelings that mattered. Do you have any idea how rare that is? He didn't trust himself to speak, so he simply shook his head. I married a good man, Adelaide continued, her voice steady despite the tears beginning to gather in her eyes. Robert was kind and gentle and everything a woman should want in a husband. But he never saw me the way you did. No one has? Adelaide. Travis's voice was barely a whisper. I'm not asking you to love me the way I love you, she said, taking another step back. I'm just asking you to let me try to earn it. Let me stay, Travis. Let me show you that some childhood promises are worth keeping. Before he could respond, she was back on her horse, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. I'll be staying at the boarding house in town. The ring is yours to keep or return, your choice. But either way, I'll be here until you decide. She touched the brim of her hat in a gesture that was pure cowboy courtesy, then turned her horse toward town. Travis watched her ride away, the ring burning like a coal in his palm, and his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm he'd almost forgotten. Behind him, he heard Jeremiah's familiar chuckle. Well, the old man said, his voice rich with satisfaction, I'd say that counts as a possibility worth keeping your heart open to. Travis looked down at the ring one more time, then carefully slipped it into his shirt pocket next to his journal. For the first time in 20 years, he had no idea what tomorrow might bring. Travis spent that night staring at the ceiling of his small room in the bunkhouse, the silver ring on his nightstand catching moonlight every time he turned his head. Sleep proved elusive, chased away by a mind that couldn't settle on any one thought for more than a few moments. 20 years of carefully maintained routine had been upended in the space of a single conversation, and he found himself as off balance as a green colt. When dawn finally broke, he was already up and dressed, coffee brewing on the small stove that served his modest quarters. The familiar rituals of morning, checking the horses, reviewing the day's work with Jeremiah, loading his wagon with tools and supplies, felt strange and disconnected, as if he were watching someone else perform tasks that had once come as naturally as breathing. "You look like hell," Jeremiah observed when they met in the yard. "Take it that young lady's visit gave you some things to think about." Travis accepted the cup of coffee his employer offered and took a grateful sip. "You knew she was coming. It wasn't a question, and Jeremiah didn't pretend otherwise. Got a letter 3 weeks ago. Asked if you were still here, still unmarried. Asked if I thought you might remember a little girl named Adelaide Summers. And you didn't think to mention this. Figured it wasn't my place." Jeremiah's eyes held the hint of a smile. "Besides, would you have believed me if I'd told you?" Travis considered that, and had to admit the old man had a point. If anyone had suggested yesterday morning that Adelaide Summers would ride back into his life with a wedding ring and a childhood promise, he'd have recommended they see the doctor about the head injury. "She's staying at Martha Kelling's boarding house," Jeremiah continued. "Took a room for 2 weeks, though I suspect she'll stay longer if you give her reason to." The thought of Adelaide just a few miles away in town made Travis's chest tight. He'd spent 20 years convincing himself that solitude was preferable to the complications that came with caring about another person. The arrival of one determined woman had shattered that careful philosophy like glass. "What am I supposed to do with this, Jeremiah?" Travis pulled the ring from his pocket and held it up to catch the morning light. "She's half my age and twice as good as I deserve. What kind of man would I be to take advantage of some misguided childhood fancy? What kind of man would you be to dismiss the genuine feelings of a grown woman who knows her own mind?" Jeremiah countered. "That girl didn't ride however many miles to play games, Travis. She came here because she loves you. She loves the memory of me, the man who was kind to her when she was 6 years. Or maybe she sees something in you that you've forgotten how to see in yourself." Jeremiah's voice carried the weight of years and hard-won wisdom. "Either way, seems to me the respectful thing would be to let her make her own decision about what she wants." Before Travis could respond, the sound of hoofbeats on the main road drew their attention. Adelaide rode into view, her posture straight and confident, despite what had to have been a restless night of her own. She was dressed in a simple riding skirt and white blouse, her hair braided back in a practical style that somehow managed to look elegant. "Morning," she called as she approached, her voice carrying the warm friendliness that Travis remembered from 20 years ago. "I hope you don't mind the early visit. I thought perhaps I could help with something around the ranch." Travis felt his mouth go dry. "Adelaide, you don't need to—" "I know I don't need to," she interrupted gently. "I want to. I've been managing my own horse and helping with ranch work for years. I'm not some delicate flower who will faint at the sight of honest labor." To prove her point, she dismounted and began checking her horse's hooves with practiced efficiency, running her hands down the mare's legs to check for heat or swelling. The easy competence of her movements spoke of genuine experience, and Travis found himself revising his assumptions about what kind of life she'd led in the years since leaving Copper Ridge. "Robert had a small spread outside Denver," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "Nothing as grand as this, but enough to keep a woman busy. I learned to mend fence, birth foals, and doctor sick cattle right alongside the hired hands." "Adelaide." Travis stepped closer, drawn despite himself by the matter-of-fact way she spoke about her late husband. "Tell me about him." "About Robert." She straightened, her hands stilling on her horse's neck. For a moment, pain flickered across her features. Not the sharp grief of fresh loss, but the deeper ache of permanent absence. "He was a good man," she said simply. 10 years older than me, steady and kind. We had 3 happy years together before the fever took him. She paused, her fingers absently stroking the mare's neck. He knew about you. Travis felt something cold settle in his stomach. What do you mean? I told him about the little girl who promised to marry a ranch hand in Wyoming when she grew up. I told him I still carried that promise in my heart, even though I was prepared to honor my marriage vows. Adelaide's eyes met his, clear and unflinching. He said he hoped that if anything ever happened to him, I'd have the courage to follow my heart. The words hit Travis like a physical blow. He'd been prepared for accusations of stealing another man's widow, for guilt about dishonoring the memory of the dead. He hadn't been prepared for a husband's blessing delivered from beyond the grave. He sounds like a wise man, Jeremiah said quietly. Travis had almost forgotten the older man was there, listening to this intensely personal conversation with the respectful attention of a judge weighing evidence. He was. Adelaide's smile was soft with memory. He would have liked you both. Robert always said the measure of a man wasn't in his words, but in how he treated those who couldn't do anything for him in return. The way you treated a lonely little girl 20 years ago told me everything I needed to know about your character. She pulled a faded photograph from her pocket and held it out to Travis. The image was creased and worn from years of handling, showing the ranch yard much as it looked today. In the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, was Travis himself, had pushed back and sleeves rolled up as he worked with one of the horses. I've carried this picture for 20 years, Adelaide said. It's the only one I have of you, taken by my father on our last day here. Some might call it foolish sentiment, but it's been my anchor through some very difficult times. Travis stared at the photograph, seeing himself as he'd been 2 decades ago, younger, less worn by time and solitude, but recognizably the same man. The fact that she'd treasured this small reminder for so long spoke to a devotion that went far beyond childhood fancy. You really mean this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, every word. Adelaide tucked the photograph back into her pocket. I know it seems impossible, Travis. I know it goes against everything people expect from a proper widow. But I've spent 3 years in mourning, and before that, 3 years as a dutiful wife to a man I respected but never truly loved. I'm 26 years old, and I'm tired of living my life according to other people's expectations. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the determination burning in her blue eyes. I want to live it according to my own heart, and my heart has belonged to you since I was 6 years old. Over the next week, Adelaide became a fixture at the Broken Arrow Ranch. True to her word, she proved herself capable with ranch work, mending fence with steady hands and helping with the spring branding with a competence that earned the grudging respect of even the most skeptical hands. But it was her presence around Travis that truly transformed the rhythm of his days. She would arrive each morning just after sunrise, her horse loaded with supplies for whatever task needed doing. Sometimes she brought fresh bread from the boarding house kitchen, still warm and fragrant. Other times, she carried a thermos of coffee and a simple breakfast that they would share on the porch while planning the day's work. Travis found himself looking forward to these quiet moments with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified him. After 20 years of solitary mornings, the simple pleasure of shared conversation felt like a luxury he didn't deserve. But Adelaide seemed determined to prove that he did deserve it, that he deserved all the good things life might offer. You're different when she's around, Jeremiah observed one evening as they watched Adelaide help one of the younger hands doctor a cut on his horse's leg. More like the man I always suspected you could be. Travis followed the older man's gaze, watching as Adelaide spoke in low, soothing tones to calm the nervous animal. Her touch was gentle but confident, and the horse responded to her presence with the kind of trust that couldn't be forced or faked. She has a way with animals, Travis said, deflecting from the personal observation. She has a way with you, Jeremiah corrected. Question is, are you going to let yourself enjoy it? Or are you going to keep fighting something that's bringing joy to everyone around here? It was true that Adelaide's presence had lifted the spirits of the entire ranch. The hands, initially skeptical of this young woman with her unconventional declaration, had quickly warmed to her genuine interest in their work and her willingness to pull her own weight. She remembered names, asked about families, and listened to their stories with the kind of attention that made men feel valued. But it was the small gestures toward Travis that truly revealed her character. The way she mended a tear in his shirt, without being asked, leaving it folded neatly on his bunk with a sprig of wildflowers tucked into the pocket. The careful attention she paid to his preferences, ensuring his coffee was exactly the right strength, and his meals included the vegetables he actually enjoyed eating. The 1,000 tiny kindnesses that spoke of a woman who'd been paying attention to the details of his life long before she'd arrived. On the 7th day of her stay, Adelaide surprised him by producing a small wooden horse from her saddlebag, the same toy he'd carved for her 20 years ago during one of those long evenings when the family had lingered at the ranch. "I've carried this with me everywhere," she said, placing the worn carving in his hands. "Through 3 moves, a marriage, a husband's death, and every moment of doubt I've ever had about whether I was foolish to hold on to a childhood dream." Travis turned the small horse over in his palms, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his hands despite the passage of time. The wood was smooth from years of handling, polished to a warm glow by Adelaide's fingers. Carved into the base in his own careful script were the words, "For Adelaide, who will grow up to be someone special." "You remember carving this?" she asked softly. "I remember everything about those 3 days," Travis admitted. "Your father was telling stories about Oregon Territory, your mother was teaching you to darn socks, and you were following me around asking if horses dream and whether cattle have favorite colors." Adelaide's laugh was warm and genuine. "I still wonder about those things sometimes. Do you think they do? Dream, I mean." "I think all God's creatures dream," Travis said, his thumb tracing the wooden horse's mane. "Question is whether they're brave enough to chase those dreams when they have the chance." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Adelaide stepped closer, her hand covering his, where it held the carving. "What do you dream about, Travis?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, Travis allowed himself to be completely honest. "I dream about having someone to come home to, someone who sees past the mistakes I've made and the years I've wasted, someone who thinks I'm worth loving despite all evidence to the contrary." "That's not a dream," Adelaide said, her fingers tightening over his. "That's what I'm offering you, what I've been offering you since the day I arrived." Travis looked into her eyes, seeing not the starry-eyed romanticism of youth, but the steady determination of a woman who'd lived through loss and chosen hope anyway. In that moment, he felt something shift inside him, not the dramatic revelation of novels, but a quiet settling, like a bone finally healing after a long break. "Adelaide," he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the tangle of emotions in his chest. "I know you're scared," she said gently. "I know this feels impossible and probably wrong to a man who spent 20 years believing he doesn't deserve happiness. But I need you to understand something. I'm not here because I feel sorry for you or because I'm trying to recapture something from my childhood. I'm here because in 20 years of living, no one has ever made me feel as cherished as you did in 3 days. She paused, her thumb stroking across his knuckles. "You looked at a lonely little girl and saw someone worth your time and attention. You carved her a toy that told her she was special, and you made her feel safe in a world that often felt very big and frightening. Do you know what that meant to her? Do you know what it means to the woman she became?" Travis felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Adelaide, let me finish," she said firmly. "I married a good man and lived a good life, but Robert never saw me the way you did. He saw a wife, a helpmate, a pleasant companion. He never saw the dreamer who still believes in impossible things, or the woman who carries a wooden horse because it reminds her that some people are worth waiting for." She reached up with her free hand and touched his cheek, her fingers cool against his skin. "You see me, Travis? You always have. And if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life showing you that you're worth seeing too." Travis closed, his eyes feeling 20 years of careful solitude crumbling under the weight of her unwavering faith. When he opened them again, Adelaide was still there, patient and steady, and utterly certain of what she wanted. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to be what you need." "You already are," she said simply. "You just need to believe it." For the first time since she'd arrived, Travis allowed himself to consider the possibility that she might be right, that maybe, just maybe, some promises were meant to be kept after all. As the second week of Adelaide's stay began, the careful boundaries Travis had maintained started to blur. He found himself looking forward to her arrival each morning with an eagerness that both surprised and unsettled him. Their conversations had grown deeper, moving beyond the safe topics of ranch work and weather to touch on dreams, regrets, and the thousand small experiences that shape a life. It was during one of these conversations that Adelaide revealed the existence of letters she'd written but never sent, dozens of them, chronicling her life over the past 20 years and addressed to him. "I started writing them about 6 months after we left Copper Ridge," she explained, pulling a bundle of envelopes from her saddlebag. They were tied with a faded blue ribbon, the paper yellowed with age and handling. At first, they were just a little girl's way of processing her feelings. But as I got older, they became something more, a way of keeping you close even when you were hundreds of miles away. Travis accepted the bundle with hands that weren't entirely steady. The weight of so many words, so many years of thoughts and feelings directed toward him, felt almost overwhelming. "You don't have to read them all," Adelaide said quickly, perhaps sensing his uncertainty. "But I wanted you to see them, to understand that my feelings for you weren't just some childhood fancy that I've built up in my memory. They've been a constant in my life for 20 years. That evening, alone in his small room, Travis carefully untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The childish handwriting and misspelled words brought a smile to his face, but the sincerity of emotion behind them made his chest tight. "Dear Travis," the first letter began, "Mama says we're in Oregon now, and it's very pretty, but I miss the ranch and I miss you. Papa bought me a new dress, but I wish I had my old one, because you said the blue one made my eyes look like summer sky. I still have the horse you made me, and I tell it about you every night before I go to sleep." As he read through the years of correspondence, Travis watched Adelaide grow from child to young woman through her words. The letters documented her education, her dreams of returning to Wyoming, her marriage to Robert, and the complex emotions that came with loving one man while carrying another in her heart. "I know it seems wrong to love Robert and still dream of you," one letter from early in her marriage read, "but Robert understands. He says the heart is big enough to hold many kinds of love, and that the love I carry for you doesn't diminish what I feel for him. He's a wise man, my husband, and I hope someday you'll meet him and see why I was grateful to have him in my life, even if he could never be you." The later letters, written after Robert's death, spoke of grief and healing, of a woman finding her way back to herself after loss. But through it all, the constant thread was her intention to return to Wyoming, to find Travis and fulfill the promise she'd made as a child. "I know you probably think I'm foolish," the most recent letter read, dated just 3 weeks before her arrival. A grown woman chasing after a childhood dream that may have no basis in reality. "But I've learned that life is too short and too uncertain to ignore the deepest truths of your heart. My deepest truth has always been that I belong with you. I hope you'll give me the chance to prove it." By the time Travis finished reading the last letter, dawn was breaking outside his window. He sat surrounded by 20 years of Adelaide's thoughts and feelings, understanding for the first time the depth of commitment that had brought her back to him. This wasn't the impulsive gesture of a romantic young woman. It was the calculated decision of someone who'd weighed her options carefully and chosen love over safety. The revelation both humbled and terrified him. To be the object of such unwavering devotion felt like a responsibility he wasn't sure he was worthy of carrying. But it also filled him with a warmth he'd almost forgotten was possible. The knowledge that somewhere in the world, someone had been thinking of him with love for 20 years. When Adelaide arrived that morning, she found him sitting on the porch with the letters spread around him like autumn leaves. "You read them," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Everyone." Travis looked up at her, seeing the vulnerability she was trying to hide behind a calm facade. "Adelaide, He stopped, struggling to find words adequate to what he was feeling. "It's all right if they change things," she said quickly. "I know it's a lot to take in, knowing someone has been carrying you in their thoughts for so long. If it makes you uncomfortable—" "It doesn't make me uncomfortable," Travis interrupted, standing and taking her hands in his. "It makes me feel like the luckiest man alive and the biggest fool in Wyoming all at the same time." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've spent 20 years convincing myself I was better off alone. And here you've been writing me letters that would have made those years a hell of a lot less lonely if I'd known about them." His thumbs stroked over her knuckles, marveling at the softness of her skin. "You've loved me through marriages and deaths and moves and God knows what else, and I've been too scared to even admit I missed you." Adelaide's eyes brightened with tears. "You missed me?" "Every day," Travis admitted. "I told myself it was just nostalgia for a simpler time. But reading your letters, seeing how you never stopped believing in what we had those 3 days, it made me realize I've been lying to myself." He pulled her closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her blue eyes. "I've loved you for 20 years, Adelaide Hartwell. I just didn't have the courage to admit it, even to myself." "Say that again," she whispered. "I love you." The words came easier the second time, feeling natural and right in a way that surprised him. "I love the little girl who promised to marry me when she grew up, and I love the woman who was brave enough to come back and collect on that promise." Adelaide's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with joy. "I love you too, Travis McKenna. I always have." When he kissed her, it was with 20 years of suppressed longing and newfound hope. Her lips were soft and warm beneath his, and she melted into his arms as if she'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. Perhaps she had been. Perhaps they both had. The days that followed their declaration were filled with a tentative joy that neither Travis nor Adelaide quite knew how to navigate. 20 years of separation had created a gulf that love alone couldn't immediately bridge, and they found themselves learning each other all over again. Not as the man and child they'd been, but as the adults they'd become. Adelaide moved from the boarding house to a small cabin on the ranch that had once housed the foreman's family. Jeremiah had suggested the arrangement with his characteristic practicality, pointing out that it would be easier for her to help with ranch work if she didn't have to ride back and forth from town each day. The unspoken understanding was that it would also allow Travis and Adelaide to spend more time together without subjecting their relationship to the constant scrutiny of the town's gossips. It was during one of their evening walks around the property that Adelaide noticed the scars on Travis's hands, old marks that spoke of violence rather than honest labor. When she asked about them, his expression closed off in a way she hadn't seen since her first day back. "It's nothing worth talking about," he said, pulling his hands away from her touch. "Travis," Adelaide's voice was gentle but firm, "if we're going to build a life together, we can't have secrets between us." Those scars didn't come from ranch work. For a long moment Travis stood silent, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. "I served in the war," he said. "Union Army, Colorado Volunteers. Spent 3 years fighting in places that don't exist on any civilized map." Adelaide waited, sensing that pushing would only make him retreat further. "I was good at it," Travis continued, the words coming slowly, as if each one cost him something. "Better than any man should be at killing other men. My hands—" He looked down at the scars, his expression haunted. "These came from the last battle I fought. The last battle I could stand to fight." "What happened?" Travis was quiet for so long that Adelaide thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. We were supposed to take a Confederate position outside Glorietta Pass. Intelligence said it was lightly defended, mostly supply wagons and wounded men. But when we got there, he stopped, his jaw working as if the words were physically painful to speak. It was a field hospital, he said finally, full of boys who weren't much older than you were when I first met you. Boys who couldn't run, couldn't fight back, could barely stand. And my orders were to take no prisoners. Adelaide felt her heart break for the young man Travis had been, faced with an impossible choice in an impossible situation. I couldn't do it, Travis said. Couldn't follow orders that would have made me into something I wasn't willing to become. So I helped them escape instead, as many as I could get out before my own men realized what I was doing. That's how you got the scars. Bayonet fight with my own sergeant. When he tried to stop me, Travis held up his hands, showing her the old wounds that crisscrossed his palms and fingers. Took these protecting boys I didn't even know, boys who'd have killed me if they'd had the strength. But I couldn't live with myself if I'd done what I was ordered to do. What happened to you after? Court-martial? Should have been executed for disobeying orders and assaulting a superior officer. Travis's smile was bitter. But there were witnesses to what I'd done, men who testified that I'd saved lives instead of taking them. The judge advocate was a decent man who understood that war can put a soldier in situations where there are no good choices. So you were discharged, honorably, with a commendation for valor that I never felt I deserved. Travis looked at her then, his eyes full of old pain. I've spent 20 years trying to convince myself that I did the right thing, but the truth is, I don't know. All I know is that I couldn't live with blood on my hands that didn't need to be there. Adelaide reached for his scarred hands, holding them gently in her own. You saved those boys, some of them. Not all. The ones you saved got to go home to their families because of you. They got to live full lives, maybe marry and have children of their own. That matters, Travis. Does it? His voice was raw with doubt. Sometimes I think I'd have been better off following orders. At least then I'd know where I stood, instead of spending 20 years wondering if I was a hero or a coward. You're neither, Adelaide said firmly. You're a man who chose compassion over duty when the two couldn't coexist. That doesn't make you a hero or a coward. It makes you human. She brought his hands to her lips, pressing gentle kisses to the old scars. These marks don't make you damaged or unworthy of love. They make you the man I've been waiting for, someone who values life over orders, mercy over revenge. Travis felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of shame and self-doubt that had been tied tight for 20 years. You don't understand what it was like, Adelaide. What I was like during the war. The things I did before that last battle were done by a soldier following orders in a war he didn't start. Adelaide interrupted. The man I love is the one who chose mercy when he could have chosen vengeance. The man who's spent 20 years being gentle with horses and kind to ranch hands and patient with little girls who made impossible promises. She stepped closer, her hand still holding his. The war was 20 years ago, Travis. The man you are now is the one who matters to me. As if to prove her point, a commotion from the main yard drew their attention. One of the younger hands, barely 18 and still learning his way around the ranch, had been thrown by a green horse and was lying motionless in the dust. Travis was moving before he consciously decided to, his scarred hands gentle as he checked the boy for injuries, while Adelaide calmed the spooked horse. Just had the wind knocked out of him, Travis determined after a careful examination. But we'll want the doc to take a look at that shoulder. He helped the young man to his feet with infinite patience, supporting his weight while Adelaide led the horse away to be checked for injuries of its own. The care he showed for both horse and rider spoke to a character shaped by compassion rather than violence. Later, after the doctor had confirmed that no serious harm had been done, Adelaide found Travis sitting alone on the porch of her cabin, staring out at the star-filled sky. "Thank you," she said, settling beside him on the wooden steps. "For what?" "For trusting me with your story. For letting me see the scars that made you who you are." She leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm, in the cool evening air. "I know it wasn't easy to tell me. Nothing about this is easy," Travis admitted. 20 years of keeping people at arm's length doesn't disappear overnight. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing you a disservice, letting you tie your life to a man who spent so long learning how to be alone. "You're not alone anymore," Adelaide said simply. "And neither am I. We're learning how to be together, and that's going to take time." "But Travis," she turned to look at him, her eyes serious in the moonlight, "I need you to understand that your past doesn't scare me. It makes me love you more, not less." "How can you say that?" "Because it tells me who you really are when everything else is stripped away. You're a man who chooses to protect rather than harm, who values life over duty, who carries 20 years of guilt for doing the right thing in an impossible situation." Adelaide's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. "That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be proud of." Travis brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Adelaide Hartwell, more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone." "I love you too, Travis McKenna." Scars and all, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars, and beginning to believe that perhaps some promises were not only worth keeping, but worth the 20-year wait it had taken to fulfill them. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a well-dressed stranger who introduced himself as Mr. Charles Hartwell, attorney at law from Denver. Adelaide had been helping Travis repair a section of fence damaged by the previous night's storm when the man approached, his city clothes and soft hands marking him as someone unused to ranch life. "Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell?" he inquired, his voice carrying the clipped precision of educated speech. "That's me," Adelaide replied, setting down her tools and wiping her hands on her work apron. Travis noticed the way she straightened, her body tensing, as if preparing for a blow. "I represent the estate of your late husband, Robert Hartwell. Specifically, I represent the interests of his family." The lawyer produced an official-looking envelope from his leather satchel. "I have correspondence for you regarding certain legal matters that require your immediate attention." Adelaide accepted the letter with obvious reluctance, her face pale as she broke the wax seal. Travis moved closer, close enough to offer support, but far enough to give her privacy. As she read, he watched her expression change from concern to anger to something approaching fear. "What is it?" Travis asked when she finished reading. Adelaide looked up at him, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "They're threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent. On what grounds?" Travis's voice was dangerously quiet. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hartwell's recent behavior suggests a concerning lack of judgment, abandoning her proper mourning period to pursue an inappropriate relationship with a man of questionable character." Questionable character. Travis took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "Travis, don't!" Adelaide placed a restraining hand on his arm, though her own voice shook with anger. "Mr. Hartwell, you can tell Robert's family that I'm perfectly competent and that my personal choices are none of their concern." "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple." The lawyer's smile was coldly professional. "There's also the matter of your inheritance. Robert's family believes that a woman showing such poor judgment might not be capable of managing the substantial assets left to her. They're prepared to file papers to have you declared incompetent and the inheritance transferred to more responsible hands." "The inheritance I've already refused." Adelaide's voice rose slightly. "The inheritance I told them repeatedly I didn't want?" "Refusing a substantial legacy could itself be seen as evidence of mental instability," the lawyer replied smoothly. "No rational person would turn down such wealth unless their judgment was compromised." Travis felt his blood begin to boil. "So she's crazy if she takes the money, and crazy if she doesn't. That's convenient logic. The family is prepared to be reasonable," the lawyer continued, ignoring Travis entirely. "If Mrs. Hartwell returns to Denver immediately and submits to a proper evaluation by physicians of their choosing, they might be willing to reconsider their position." "And if she refuses?" Travis asked. The lawyer's smile turned predatory. "Then they'll have no choice but to pursue all legal remedies available to them." including a thorough investigation into the character and background of anyone who might be influencing her poor decisions. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Travis understood the implication perfectly. They would dig into his past, his military service, anything they could use to paint him as an unfit companion for a respectable widow. "I need time to think," Adelaide said finally. "Of course. But I should mention that the family has received some disturbing information about your current situation." The lawyer produced another document from his satchel. "Information suggesting that your companion here may not be the honorable man he appears to be." Travis felt his stomach drop as the lawyer unfolded what appeared to be official military documents. According to these records, Mr. McKenna was court-martialed for cowardice in the face of the enemy and disobeying direct orders. He was dishonorably discharged after assaulting a superior officer and abandoning his post during a crucial battle. "That's a lie," Travis said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The documents looked official, complete with military seals and signatures. Is it?" The lawyer's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "These records suggest otherwise. They paint a picture of a man who lost his nerve when his country needed him most. A man who chose his own safety over his duty to his fellow soldiers." Adelaide snatched the documents from the lawyer's hands, scanning them quickly. Travis watched her face as she read, seeing doubt flicker in her eyes for just a moment before being replaced by fierce determination. "These are forgeries," she said flatly. "I assure you, they are quite authentic, obtained directly from military archives in Washington." The lawyer's tone was reasonable, almost sympathetic. "I understand this must be difficult to hear, Mrs. Hartwell. Discovery that the man you've been trusting is not who he claims to be can be quite shocking." "Get off this property," Travis said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now, I'm afraid I can't do that until Mrs. Hartwell gives me her answer." The lawyer turned back to Adelaide. "The family is prepared to overlook this unfortunate episode if you come to your senses quickly. But if you insist on associating with men of such questionable character, they'll have no choice but to take steps to protect you from your own poor judgment." Adelaide looked from the documents to Travis, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. "I need to speak with Travis alone, of course. But Mrs. Hartwell, time is of the essence. The family won't wait indefinitely for you to come to your senses." After the lawyer left, Adelaide and Travis stood in the yard, the forged documents scattered at their feet like fallen leaves. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears and doubts. "You don't believe them," Adelaide said finally, but there was a question in her voice. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Travis bent to gather the papers, studying them with growing despair. The forgeries were expertly done, complete with official seals and signatures that looked genuine to his untrained eye. "Maybe they're right. Maybe you'd be better off." "Don't you dare!" Adelaide's voice cut through his self-doubt like a blade. "Don't you dare let them win by making you doubt yourself." "Adelaide, look at these documents. They look real. If they can produce evidence like this, then they can produce evidence of anything they want." Adelaide grabbed the papers from his hands and began tearing them into pieces. "I don't care what lies they've manufactured about you, Travis. I know who you are. Do you?" Travis's voice was raw with pain. "Because right now I'm not sure I do." Adelaide stepped closer, her hands framing his face. "You're the man who saved enemy soldiers because it was the right thing to do. You're the man who spent 20 years being gentle with horses and kind to children. You're the man I've loved since I was 6 years old, and no forged document is going to change that." "What if they're not forged?" Travis asked quietly. "What if everything I've told myself about that day was just a lie I created to live with what I did?" "Then you're still the man I love," Adelaide said firmly. "Whatever happened 20 years ago doesn't change who you are now. It doesn't change what we have together." Travis wanted to believe her, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. The documents looked so official, so authentic. What if his memories of that day were wrong? What if he really had been a coward who abandoned his post? "They'll destroy us both if you stay," he said finally. They have resources I can't fight, connections I don't have. Maybe it would be better if you went back to Denver. Is that what you want?" Adelaide's voice was steady, but Travis could see the pain in her eyes. Travis looked at her, this brave, beautiful woman who'd given up everything to come back to him, and felt his heart breaking. "What I want doesn't matter. What matters is protecting you from the consequences of loving me. The consequences of loving you are mine to bear," Adelaide said fiercely, "and I choose to bear them gladly." But even as she spoke the words, Travis could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. The lawyer had done his work well, planting questions that would grow in the dark corners of their minds. By the time they discovered the truth about the forged documents, would it be too late to save what they'd built together? That night, Travis sat alone in his room, staring at the silver ring Adelaide had given him. For the first time since she'd returned, he seriously considered giving it back. Travis was gone when Adelaide woke the next morning. His bunk was neatly made, his few possessions gathered, and the silver ring she'd given him lay on his pillow alongside a brief note. "You deserve better than the shadow of doubt they've created. Find happiness, Adelaide. Just find it with someone worthy of you." Adelaide stood in the empty bunkhouse, the note trembling in her hands, feeling as if the ground had opened beneath her feet. After 20 years of waiting and planning, after finding the courage to chase her childhood promise across half the country, Travis had simply vanished in the night like a man, running from something he couldn't face. But Adelaide Hartwell had not survived 3 years of widowhood and a journey back to Wyoming to be defeated by forged documents and a man's wounded pride. If Travis McKenna thought he could protect her by running away, he was about to learn that some women don't accept protection they haven't asked for. She found Jeremiah in the main house kitchen, his weathered face grim as he poured coffee with hands that shook slightly with age and emotion. "You knew he was leaving," Adelaide said. "It wasn't a question. Tried to talk him out of it." Jeremiah's voice was rough with disappointment. "Spent half the night arguing with that stubborn fool, but he's got his mind made up that he's protecting you from something." "Where did he go?" "North, toward the mountains. Said he was going to find work on one of the cattle spreads up that way." Jeremiah studied her face carefully. "You planning to go after him?" "I'm planning to prove those documents were forged and drag him back here by his ear if necessary," Adelaide replied, with more confidence than she felt. "But first, I need to know everything you can tell me about Travis's military service." Jeremiah's expression shifted, becoming thoughtful. "Now that's interesting. You know, in 20 years of working with that man, he's only mentioned the war a handful of times. But when he did," the old rancher paused, his eyes distant with memory. "When he did, it was always with pride, not shame. Talked about men he'd served with, officers he'd respected. Never sounded like a man carrying the kind of guilt a coward would bear. Did he ever mention specific battles, unit designations?" "Colorado Volunteers, 1st Regiment. Fought at Glorieta Pass, among other places." Jeremiah's eyes sharpened. "Why? You think those papers were lies?" "I know they were lies." Adelaide's voice carried absolute certainty. "The question is, how to prove it." Over the next 2 days, Adelaide threw herself into investigation with the determination of a woman fighting for her future. She sent telegrams to military archives in Washington, wrote letters to veterans organizations, and even tracked down a former Union officer living in Cheyenne who might have served with Travis. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Martha Kelling, the boarding house proprietor, mentioned during casual conversation that her late husband had served with the Colorado Volunteers and that she still had his old letters and military documents stored in her attic. Henry always said the boys from Colorado were the finest soldiers he ever served with, Martha said as she led Adelaide up the narrow stairs to the dusty storage space. "Brave as lions and twice as loyal. If your Travis was one of them, then those papers calling him a coward are nothing but lies." In a trunk filled with the ephemera of a soldier's life, Adelaide found what she was looking for: official correspondence between officers, battalion reports, and most importantly, a letter of commendation signed by Colonel John Chivington himself. praising the heroic actions of Sergeant Travis McKenna during the Battle of Glorietta Pass. "Listen to this," Adelaide said, her voice shaking with emotion as she read aloud. "Sergeant McKenna distinguished himself through exceptional valor when he single-handedly rescued 15 wounded Confederate soldiers from a burning field hospital, suffering severe injuries in the process. His actions embodied the highest traditions of military service and Christian compassion." Martha's eyes filled with tears. 15 boys who got to go home to their families because of your Travis. And someone's trying to call him a coward? Adelaide carefully folded the commendation and slipped it into her pocket alongside the other evidence she'd gathered. The forged documents claimed Travis had been court-martialed for abandoning his post. But the truth was far different. He'd been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroic actions. "Mrs. Kelling," Adelaide said, her mind racing with plans. "How quickly can you spread word through town that I need to speak with every man, woman, and child in Copper Ridge? I have something important to tell them about Travis McKenna." By sunset, word had spread through the small community like wildfire. The town gathered in the main street, curiosity and concern written on every face. Adelaide stood on the porch of the general store, the real military documents clutched in her hands, and faced the people who had become her neighbors and friends. "Most of you know why I came to Copper Ridge," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "You know about the promise I made as a child and the ring I brought back to Travis McKenna. Some of you probably think I'm a foolish woman chasing after a romantic notion." A murmur of disagreement rippled through the crowd. In the weeks she'd been there, Adelaide had won the respect and affection of the townspeople through her honest work and genuine kindness. 2 days ago, a lawyer came here with documents claiming that Travis was a coward and a deserter. These lies were meant to drive us apart, to make me doubt the character of the man I love. Adelaide held up the forged papers. "But I know Travis McKenna just as you all know him. I know the man who's worked this ranch for 20 years, who's helped birth your foals and mend your fences and never asked for anything in return but honest work and fair wages." She produced the real commendation, unfolding it carefully. "This is the truth about Travis McKenna. He's not a coward, he's a hero. He saved 15 lives during the war, Confederate and Union alike, because he believed that mercy was more important than vengeance. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions, not court-martialed for cowardice." The crowd erupted in exclamations of amazement and indignation. Someone called out, "Where is Travis now?" "He left," Adelaide said, her voice breaking slightly. "He believed the lies about himself, believed that staying with me would somehow damage my reputation or put me in danger. He sacrificed his own happiness because he thought it would protect mine. Well, that's the most foolish thing I ever heard," declared Martha Kelling, stepping forward from the crowd. "Protecting a woman by breaking her heart doesn't make a lick of sense, which is why I need your help," Adelaide continued. "I need to find Travis and bring him home. I need him to see these documents, to understand that the lies they told about him can't change the truth of who he is. But more than that, I need him to know that this community, his community, stands behind him." Old Pete Hansen, who ran the blacksmith shop, spoke up from the back of the crowd. "What do you need us to do?" "Help me find him. He went north toward the mountain spreads looking for work. Someone in this town must know someone who's seen him or hired him." Adelaide's voice grew stronger with each word. "And when we find him, I want him to see that he's not alone, that he has a family here, people who care about him and believe in him." "You'll have it," Jeremiah called out, stepping forward to stand beside Adelaide. "Every man and woman here owes Travis McKenna a debt of gratitude for the work he's done and the kind of man he's been. If you're willing to fight for him, then we'll fight right alongside you." The crowd erupted in cheers and calls of agreement. As Adelaide looked out at the faces of the people who had embraced both her and Travis, she felt a surge of hope, stronger than any doubt. Travis McKenna might be running from what he thought was the truth about himself, but he was about to discover that sometimes the people who love you see your worth more clearly than you see it yourself. The next morning, Adelaide set out with a small group of volunteers, armed with the real military documents and a determination that had been 20 years in the making. She'd waited 2 decades to fulfill a childhood promise. She wasn't about to let Travis's wounded pride and a packet of lies keep her from claiming the happiness they both deserved. Behind her, the town of Copper Ridge buzzed with activity as neighbors organized search parties and spread word through the territory. Travis McKenna was about to learn that running away from love was a lot harder when an entire community was determined to bring you home. Adelaide found Travis 3 days later at a remote cattle camp high in the mountains, working for a rancher who'd asked no questions about his past and offered only basic wages and a place to sleep. She spotted him from a distance, his familiar silhouette bent over a fence post, and felt her heart leap with relief and determination. He looked up as she approached, his face cycling through surprise, joy, and resignation in the space of a few heartbeats.
Adelaide.
"You shouldn't have come up here. Where else would I be?" She dismounted and walked toward him, noting the way he instinctively stepped back. "Did you really think I'd let you disappear without a fight? Those documents were lies." Adelaide pulled the real commendation from her saddlebag and held it out to him. "This is the truth about Travis McKenna, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, hero, the man who saved 15 lives because mercy mattered more than orders." Travis stared at the document, his hands trembling as he read the words that vindicated everything he'd believed about himself for 20 years. "How did you—" "I fought for you," Adelaide said simply. "The way you would have fought for me if our positions were reversed. I dug through archives and attics and old letters until I found the truth." "Your truth, Adelaide?" Travis's voice was rough with emotion. "Even if these other documents were forged, it doesn't change the fact that Robert's family has resources I can't match. They'll find other ways to hurt you if you stay with me. Let them try." Adelaide stepped closer, close enough to see the tears gathering in his eyes. "Do you know what I did before I came to find you?" Travis shook his head. "I stood in the main street of Copper Ridge and told every person in town exactly who you are and exactly why I love you. I showed them the real documents, explained about the forged ones, and asked for their help in bringing you home. Adelaide, I'm not finished." Her voice carried the authority of a woman who'd made up her mind. "Then I took out the marriage certificate from my first wedding and burned it right there in front of everyone. Burned it to ash because I'm done carrying the past around like a burden. I'm done letting other people's expectations define what I can and can't do with my own life." Travis felt his world shift as the implications of her words sank in. "You burned your marriage certificate?" "Every last piece of it, along with any claim Robert's family might have thought they had over my choices." Adelaide's smile was fierce and beautiful. "I'm Adelaide Summers again, Travis. The little girl who made you a promise 20 years ago, and the woman who intends to keep it." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the silver ring, holding it up between them like a bridge across 2 decades of separation. "This ring has been waiting for 20 years to find its proper home. I'm not going to let lies and legal threats keep it waiting any longer." "The townspeople," Travis said, still struggling to process what she was telling him. "What did they say when you told them about—" "They said it was about time someone fought for Travis McKenna, the way he's always fought for everyone else." Adelaide took his left hand in hers, her fingers gentle against his scarred palm. "They said they've known for 20 years what kind of man you are, and no forged document was going to change their minds." Travis looked down at their joined hands, seeing the ring poised above his finger like a promise about to be fulfilled. "Adelaide, I don't know how to be what you need. You already are what I need." She slid the ring onto his finger, the silver warm from her touch. "You're the man who sees me for who I really am. You're the man who makes me feel precious and protected and valued. You're the man I've loved since I was 6 years old." The ring settled into place, as if it had always belonged there. As if 20 years of separation had been nothing more than a brief interruption in an inevitable story. "I love you." "Travis McKenna," Adelaide said, her voice steady and sure. I love your scars and your kindness and your stubborn determination to protect people, even when it costs you everything. I love the way you see the best in everyone except yourself. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life showing you what I see when I look at you." Travis pulled her into his arms then, holding her tight against his chest as 20 years of loneliness and self-doubt finally began to crack apart. "I love you too, Adelaide. I've loved you since you were 6 years old and told me I was the nicest man in the whole world." "You are," she whispered against his shoulder. "And now you're mine." When they kissed, it tasted like promises kept and dreams finally coming true. In the distance, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of half the population of Copper Ridge, come to witness the homecoming of one of their own. The delegation from Copper Ridge arrived like a small army of neighbors turned family, with Jeremiah at the front and Martha Kelling riding beside him with a basket that smelled of fresh bread and determination. Behind them came ranchers and shopkeepers, wives and children, all united in their mission to bring Travis McKenna home where he belonged. "About time you came to your senses," Jeremiah called out as he dismounted, his weathered face split by a grin that made him look 20 years younger. "Though I suppose Adelaide deserves the credit for knocking some sense into that thick skull of yours." Travis found himself surrounded by people who had no reason to care about his troubles, except that they did. Neighbors who had ridden 3 days into the mountains simply because Adelaide had asked them to help bring him home. The reality of their presence, their acceptance and support, hit him like a physical force. "We brought something for you," Martha announced, producing an official-looking envelope from her basket. "Telegram came through this morning from the War Department in Washington. Seems someone's been asking questions about your service record." Adelaide took the telegram and read it aloud, her voice ringing with vindication. "Official records confirm Sergeant Travis McKenna, awarded Congressional Medal of Honor for heroic actions at Glorieta Pass, March 1862. No record of court-martial or dishonorable discharge. Service record exemplary. Signed, Colonel James Morrison, Chief of Military Records." A cheer went up from the assembled crowd, and Travis felt something he'd carried for 20 years finally lift from his shoulders. Not just the doubt planted by forged documents, but the deeper uncertainty about his own worth that had haunted him since the war ended. "There's more," Adelaide continued, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "The lawyer who brought those forged documents? Turns out he wasn't representing Robert's family at all. He was hired by someone else entirely, someone who had their own reasons for wanting to discredit you." "Who?" Travis asked, though part of him was no longer sure it mattered. "Someone who saw our announcement in the Denver papers about our engagement and decided to cause trouble for reasons of their own," Jeremiah explained. "Point is, the real Hartwell family sent their own representative yesterday. Nice fellow who made it clear they have no interest in Adelaide's inheritance. And never did. Seems they're more concerned with their own affairs than meddling in the life of their late relative's widow." Travis looked around at the faces surrounding him, people who had dropped their own work and concerns to ride into the mountains, for no other reason than that one of their own needed help. The gesture spoke to something deeper than mere neighborliness. It spoke to the kind of community he'd been part of for 20 years without fully understanding what it meant. "I don't know what to say," he managed finally. "Say you'll come home," Adelaide said, stepping close enough to take his hands in hers. "Say you'll stop running from the best thing that's ever happened to either of us. Say you'll marry the girl," old Pete Hansen called out from the crowd. Sparking laughter and calls of agreement from the assembled witnesses, Travis looked down at Adelaide, seeing not the 6-year-old who'd made an impossible promise, but the woman who'd had the courage to keep it despite every obstacle the world had thrown in her path. She'd fought lawyers and lies and his own stubborn pride to stand here in the mountains, surrounded by an entire community that had come to claim him as family. "Adelaide Summers," he said, his voice carrying across the mountain clearing. "Will you marry me? Not because of a promise you made when you were 6, but because I can't imagine spending another day without you in my life." "Travis McKenna," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "I thought you'd never ask." The crowd erupted in cheers and congratulations as Travis swept Adelaide into his arms, spinning her around while the mountains echoed with the sound of their joy. When he set her down, her face was flushed with happiness and her eyes bright with tears of relief. When Martha called out, ever practical, "Because if you're planning a wedding, we'll need time to prepare proper food and decorations." "Soon," Adelaide said, never taking her eyes off Travis's face. "As soon as we can arrange it. I've waited 20 years to marry this man. I'm not waiting any longer than necessary." 2 weeks, Jeremiah announced with the authority of a man accustomed to making decisions. "That'll give everyone time to prepare and get word to folks who'll want to attend. We'll have the biggest wedding Copper Ridge has ever seen." As the celebration continued around them, Travis and Adelaide stood together in the mountain clearing, finally understanding that some promises are too powerful to be broken by time, distance, or doubt. They'd found their way back to each other despite every obstacle, and now they had a lifetime to discover what came after happily ever after. The ring on Travis's finger caught the afternoon sunlight, a circle of silver that had waited 20 years to complete its journey home. 6 months later, Travis McKenna stood at the altar of the small church in Copper Ridge, his hands steady and his heart full as he watched Adelaide walk down the aisle toward him. She was radiant in a simple white dress that Martha Kelling had sewn with loving care, her dark hair crowned with wildflowers that caught the autumn sunlight streaming through the windows. The church was packed with everyone who had played a part in their story. Ranchers and shopkeepers, cowboys and their families, all gathered to witness the fulfillment of a promise that had begun 20 years ago with a 6-year-old girl's declaration of love. Even the preacher seemed moved by the unusual romance, his voice warm with genuine affection as he spoke about the mysterious ways love could travel across time and distance. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Thompson began, his weathered hands holding the worn family Bible that had blessed 3 generations of Copper Ridge weddings. "We are gathered here today to witness something truly remarkable, the keeping of a promise that has waited 20 years to be fulfilled." Travis looked down at Adelaide as she took her place beside him, marveling again at the woman she'd become. The child's earnestness had matured into a quiet strength that had carried her through loss and uncertainty to this moment. Her blue eyes, still the same summer sky shade that had captivated him decades ago, now held the depth of experience and the certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. "Travis," the preacher continued, "do you take Adelaide to be your lawfully wedded wife? To love and cherish through all the seasons of life that God may grant you together?" "I do," Travis said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "I have since she was 6 years old, and I will until the day I die." "Adelaide, do you take Travis to be your lawfully wedded husband? To honor and respect through whatever joys and sorrows may come your way?" "I do," Adelaide replied, her voice steady and sure. "I promised him I would when I grew up, and I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The ring exchange was simple but profound. Travis slipped a matching silver band onto Adelaide's finger, its weight symbolic of the vows they'd just spoken. When Adelaide placed a plain gold band on his finger beside the silver one she'd given him months ago, the congregation murmured approval at the sight of the 2 rings together, past and present united at last. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and the grace of Almighty God," Reverend Thompson declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Travis, you may kiss your bride." When Travis kissed Adelaide, it was with 20 years of suppressed longing and infinite gratitude for the woman who'd refused to let him remain alone. The kiss was witnessed by an entire community that had come to love them both, and when they finally broke apart, the church erupted in cheers and applause that could probably be heard all the way to the ranch. The celebration that followed was everything Martha had promised and more. Tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by every family in town, and someone had procured a fiddle player who kept the dancing going until well past sunset. Children ran between the adults, caught up in the joy of the occasion, while older folks sat in chairs and watched with the satisfaction of those who'd lived long enough to see love triumph over all obstacles. "You know," Jeremiah said as he approached the newlyweds during a brief break in the festivities, "I've been thinking about that little cabin where Adelaide was staying. Seems to me it might make a fine home for a married couple, at least until you decide what you want to do long term." Travis looked at his employer, no, his friend, with deep gratitude. "Jeremiah, you've already done more than enough." "Nonsense. You've given me 20 years of loyal service and the closest thing to a son I'll ever have. Besides," the old man's eyes twinkled with mischief, "someone needs to stay close enough to help train the next generation of ranch hands." Adelaide blushed prettily at the implication, but her smile suggested the idea wasn't unwelcome. "We'll see what the future brings," she said diplomatically, as the evening wound down and the last of the guests finally headed home. Travis and Adelaide found themselves alone on the porch of what was now their cabin, watching the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky. Adelaide had changed from her wedding dress into a simple blue gown, the same shade as the dress she'd worn as a child, and Travis couldn't help but marvel at the symmetry. "No regrets?" he asked, pulling her close against his side. "Only that it took us 20 years to get here," Adelaide replied, settling into the warmth of his embrace. "But I suppose some things are worth waiting for." Travis pulled out his leather journal, the same one he'd carried for 2 decades of solitary entries about weather and cattle. Tonight, for the first time, he had something truly worth recording. "October 15th, 1882, he wrote in careful script while Adelaide watched over his shoulder. "Married Adelaide Summers today. She kept her promise, and I finally learned that I was worth keeping it for. Sometimes the best things in life come to those who are brave enough to believe in impossible dreams and patient enough to wait for them to come true." He closed the journal and set it aside, then pulled Adelaide onto his lap so he could hold her properly. In the distance, the ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms, cattle lowing softly in the pastures and horses nickering in the barn. It was the same peaceful scene Travis had witnessed thousands of times before, but tonight it felt completely different, not just the landscape of his solitude, but the foundation of a shared life. "What happens now?" Adelaide asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "Now we live," Travis said simply. "We wake up together every morning and go to sleep together every night, and we fill all the hours in between with whatever makes us happy. We work the ranch, help our neighbors, maybe raise some children of our own someday. We grow old together and sit on this same porch when we're 80, telling our grandchildren about the little girl who promised to marry a cowboy when she grew up." "That sounds perfect," Adelaide murmured, her eyes already growing heavy with contentment as they sat together under the vast Wyoming sky. Travis reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 20 years ago, he'd been a broken man convinced he deserved nothing but solitude. Tonight, he was a husband to the most remarkable woman he'd ever known, surrounded by a community that had become family, finally understanding that sometimes the greatest courage isn't found in war or adventure, but in believing that you're worthy of love. The wooden horse Adelaide had treasured for 20 years sat on the mantelpiece inside their cabin, a symbol of promises kept and dreams fulfilled. But more than that, it was a reminder that the best gifts in life often come in small packages. A child's laughter, a woman's faith, a community's acceptance, and the quiet joy of discovering that home isn't a place, but the person whose hand you hold as you face whatever tomorrow might bring. Some promises, Travis had learned, are too powerful to be broken by time, distance, or doubt, and some love stories are worth waiting 20 years to tell.